introduction, and thank you very much to the university for hosting this event. It is my honor and privilege to be here to share the situation of Iran and Amnesty's work on it with you, and thank you for taking the time to attend this lecture. I'm interested in hearing how many of you follow the human rights situation in Iran and the ongoing protests in September 2022. That's inspiring. And how many of you followed the human rights situation in Iran or heard something about it before last September? Still a good number. And what are some of the top words that come to your mind when you hear about the human rights situation in Iran? Yes? There was a hand there. Oh, sorry, maybe I didn't need. Any top words? Yes? Mahsa Amini? Yes. Okay. Anything else? For the ones who followed the human rights situation before these protests that were sparked by the death in custody of Mahsa Amini. Revolution, protest. Okay, so I ask this just to get a better sense of your familiarity with the human rights context in Iran. Of course, many people now around the world are moved by the human rights situation in Iran since September 2022, when mass protests were sparked in the country by the death in custody of this 22-year-old Kurdish woman. Her name was Mahsa Amini. At home, she went by the Kurdish name of Jina. She was traveling with her family from the city of Cyprus to Tehran when she was arrested by Iran's morality police because of her poor veiling. Veiling is compulsory in Iran. For decades, the authorities of the Islamic Republic have forced women and girls as young as 7 years old to cover their hair when they step foot outside the house. This compulsory veiling has robbed women of their right to freedom of expression, as well as of their right to equality and non-discrimination, and the right to belief and freedom of thought. For decades, women and girls were standing up to these compulsory veiling laws and practices through various ways, pushing the boundaries and expressing their right to freedom of choice when it comes to their clothing. But the death in custody of Mahsa Amini sparked a nationwide movement not only against compulsory veiling, but it very soon went beyond that and encompassed this demand for fundamental change in the political and social structure of Iran. Within 3 days of her arrest by Iran's so-called morality police, she fell into a coma, taken to a hospital and died there. And immediately after her death, protests were sparked first in her hometown of Cyprus, which is a Kurdish populated city, and very soon the protests spread to other places across the country. Since then, the protests have continued. The authorities have deployed their entire machinery of repression in order to crack down on the protests, opening fire on protesters, using metal pellets as well as severe beatings in order to crush the protests. Despite this level of brutality, the protests have continued, and this determination by the protesters shows the extent of outrage and anger that exists in the society, and the determination of the people to demand a different future for Iran that would respect their fundamental human rights and freedoms. Before I continue, I just thought I'll show you a clip from the first days of the protests when a lot of moving scenes emerged from inside the country with young women and girls burning their headscarves, putting them on bonfires, and also cutting their hair in protest at compulsory veiling, which stands as the symbol of extreme discrimination and violence against women and girls in Iran. Amnesty International prepared right at the beginning of the protest. It was in the early days when the protests were triggered across the country, and at that point we still hadn't witnessed the bloodshed that today we face. Very soon though, the authorities used the Revolutionary Guards, the Basij paramilitary forces, and all the various security forces across the country to crush the protest at any cost to human life. And within the first week of the protest, dozens of people, including women, men, and children, were killed. And sadly, that pattern of opening fire on protesters has continued to this day. We are into the 4 months of the protest now, and according to our research and the work of many other human rights defenders, over 400 people have been killed by Iran security forces with absolute impunity. These unlawful killings take place in a context of long-standing human rights violations in Iran. There is no such thing as an independent judiciary in Iran. Security forces who kill, arbitrary arrest, and torture people are never investigated, let alone prosecuted and punished. And this environment of impunity has emboldened the authorities and their security forces to use lethal force and other cruel, unlawful methods in order to crush the protest and maintain their iron grip on power. Despite this level of brutality, as I mentioned, people continue to take to the streets. You might have noticed that the international coverage is not perhaps as much as it was in the early days of the protests in September and October. That doesn't, however, mean that the protests have died down. In fact, every few weeks we have seen another eruption of protests in the country. Other forms of dissent have also continued. For example, there have been a number of nationwide strikes in the country, where many business people as well as ordinary members of the public took part in them. We also have people chanting during the night from the rooftops of their houses, demanding Iran's transition to a different political system, calling for the abolition of discriminatory laws against women, expecting equality and dignity, and basically calling for a different structure in Iran that would not rob people of their fundamental human rights and dignity. For this movement, the society is now paying a huge price. Amnesty International has not only documented the unlawful killing of hundreds of men, women, and children, We are also receiving horrifying reports about people who have been detained. According to official figures, thousands of people, including women's rights defenders, human rights defenders, lawyers, artists, teachers, labor rights activists, and others have been arrested by the security forces and are now held in cruel, inhumane conditions in various prisons and detention centers across the country. The prosecution authorities have threatened to impose harsh penalties on detainees. These penalties range from years or decades of imprisonment to the death penalty. As we speak, at least 26 protesters and others are at risk of executions in connection with the protest that we have identified. The number of people at risk could be far higher. Over the past month, in the past 4 weeks, at least 4 protesters were executed by the authorities after grossly unfair proceedings that have no resemblance whatsoever to a judicial trial. Often these young men are subjected to torture and other ill treatment in order to confess, and these false confessions are then used as evidence to convict them of crimes that are not recognizable internationally and to impose the death penalty. Death sentences are being handed down after one court session that may last from several minutes to half an hour. Detainees are deprived of their basic fair trial rights, including access to a lawyer, access to their families, access to the evidence that's used against them. The trials are taking place behind closed doors before revolutionary courts that are presided over by judges who have a history of using repressive methods against dissidents and civil society activists. Because of all these serious fair trial violations, Amnesty International has said that these proceedings have no resemblance whatsoever to a trial, and the executions and the death sentences amount to arbitrary deprivation of the right to life. This is all taking place in a country that is the largest executioner of the world after China. Sadly, for many years, human rights defenders have been struggling for the abolition of the death penalty in Iran, but the authorities have refused to change the various laws that enforce the use of the death penalty for a vast number of crimes. But even within this context, the use of the death penalty to crush the protest is a new law for the current political system in Iran. It shows that the authorities are willing to deprive people of their right to life, to crush the protests and quell the uprising at any cost. We are therefore very concerned that many more people are now at risk of having their death sentences implemented. For this reason, Amnesty International is now mobilizing its activists around the world and urging ordinary people as well as politicians to take action through any avenue that they can, as tomorrow may be too late. Every night these days we go to bed fearing that when we wake up in the morning we may hear the news of another young protester having been executed. Even last night, as I was preparing for this talk, I heard that 2 other protesters were taken to solitary confinement, and this news triggered massive fears that maybe this morning we will wake up to another horrific news. This comes after Saturday when 2 protesters were executed. I said all of this to basically remind you that the courageous movement has continued, but it is not only a time of resistance, it's also a time of massive many people inside Iran as well as human rights defenders around the world who are trying to support the protesters and their families, because we are bombarded by these horrific assaults on the right to life of protesters, and whether it's through killings or executions, the authorities show that they are determined to continue their assault on the right to life in order to end the uprising. This is a collage of the pictures of some of the young men, women and children who were killed by the authorities during the protests. As Amnesty International, we try very hard to identify the names of those killed by the authorities and to document the circumstances surrounding their killings. We always know that the real number of those killed is higher, but for us it's very important that we don't just focus on the names of those killed and give a statistical figure. It's important for us to identify how they were killed, when they were killed, which forces were involved in firing live ammunition, what kind of violations did the security forces commit by opening fire or using other forms of unlawful force against protesters. And we meticulously document these violations in reports and public statements and submissions that we prepare. We send these submissions to the UN and to governments around the world. We also create awareness about them in the media, and through all of this, we not only try to document the atrocities and create pressure on the authorities for the cruelties that they commit, but we also try to prepare the groundwork and the evidence needed for future prosecutions, be they in Iran or in other places around the world, if ever any of the authorities involved may be identified and arrested in a country outside Iran that has a proper judicial system that takes human rights violations seriously. I would pause for a moment on this collage. It shows the pictures of some of the members of Iran's Baluchi community. Baluchi people are a minority in the southwestern province of Sistan and Baluchistan in Iran, which is the most impoverished province in the country. And this minority has borne the brunt of the repressive campaign of the authorities over the past 4 months. On the 30th of September, the Iranian authorities unlawfully killed at least 100 men and children and a younger during these protests. And since then, there have been almost weekly protests after Friday prayers in this province, and the authorities have persisted in their pattern of using live ammunition and other brutal force against the protesters. As you can see, many of those killed are children under the age of 18. This is a collage of 40 children who participated in the protests or were killed by the security forces when they were present in the scene of the protest. Young people, including children, have been visibly present during these ongoing protests in the country. The younger generation is standing up to an establishment that is clearly out of touch with the younger generation in the country and their demands for a different society that would respect their basic freedoms. The authorities have unlawfully opened a fire on children as young as 9 years old. There is also the picture of a 6-year-old girl here. Actually, her picture is not here because we hadn't identified her when we did this collage. But she was struck by a tear gas canister that struck her head, and she was just 6 years old. There are also children who were fatally beaten to death. All the collage. They were teenagers aged 16 and 17. They actively participated in the protest and they were fatally beaten. The authorities have not only condemned the families of these young children to a lifetime of inconsolable sadness, but they are systematically persecuting and harassing the families of these children in order to coerce them into silence or to force them to reiterate the false narratives of the authorities. In most cases, the authorities have refused to acknowledge that their security forces killed these children. They have tried to force the families to say that their children committed suicide or died as a result of accidental falls from heights or committed drug overdose, or in one case, the authorities forced the family to say that their child was beaten by a dog and died as a result of infection. In other words, we are seeing a systematic effort by the security forces to hide the truth and cover up their crimes, and this is inflicting additional pain and suffering on the families of the children, who need to pay huge costs, including their liberty, if they want to seek truth and justice for their loved ones. This is the map of Iran, and it shows the number of children killed in various provinces across the country, and it can give you a sense of how widespread the protests have been. Even though the protests, I must say, are more widespread than what you see in this picture, this is just showing the places where children were killed. Similarly, the cities where children were killed. Despite all this brutality that I mentioned, as I said from the beginning, the society has shown a massive courage to keep the struggle alive, and this shows the trend of the protest since the death in custody of Mahsa Amini. As you can see, there have been ebbs and flows, but the protests haven't died down. And every several weeks there have been massive spikes in the number of protests. The blue line shows the strikes that have taken place across the country, and similarly you can see that the trend line is not decreasing, even though there are ebbs and flows. This is presenting the same information but in a different way. Again, you can see how widespread the protests have been across the country. And the circles that are larger show the sites of protests that have been more active across the country. Of course, it also depends on the population. You see the largest circle in Tehran province because that's where the capital of the country is, and it has the largest population in the country. And this information is not produced by Amnesty International. It is taken from this website that's monitoring the number of reported protests and strikes, envelope.info. I go back to the current situation. As I mentioned, many thousands of people are currently in detention, and several dozen people are at risk of execution. This is a collage that we created in late-December for some of the prisoners that Amnesty International has identified as being at risk of execution. Sadly, two of them are no longer with us. They were executed this Saturday, this young man and this young man. The executions were carried out suddenly without any advance notice to their families, and the authorities did not even allow the family of one of the men to say goodbye and farewell to their loved one, and the other young man did not even have any parents to defend him and to take up his case. All the other ones remain at risk of execution. Their cases are at various stages within the so-called judicial system in the country, but as I mentioned, the judiciary is not independent and does not pay any attention to basic due process standards. In order to save the lives of these young men, it is immensely critical that activists and human rights defenders from around the world mobilize in order to create awareness about the stories of these young people and the human rights violations that the authorities committed against them in order to secure these death sentences. And we can only hope that by putting pressure on the Iranian authorities, they may reconsider and quash the death sentences. Sadly, we face an establishment at the moment that is apparently only interested in maintaining its power and surviving the protests that have challenged its, that have posed the greatest challenge to its system since the revolution of 1979. As a result, the authorities are sending every signal to the society that they would continue their campaign of lethal repression. However, this is not the time to lose hope because that's all we've got in order to do whatever we can to save the lives of people who are at risk of the death penalty. I must say that all these horrific violations do not take place in a vacuum. Iran has seen successive days of bloodshed in its recent history. Since 1979, when the current political system in Iran was formed, the authorities have executed thousands of people in order to crush dissent and in order to maintain the ideological system that they have put in place. The pictures that you see in the second slide are some of the protesters who were killed in 2019. There were mass protests in 2019 as well. During that period, the authorities killed in the course of less than 5 days hundreds of men, women and children. They were never held to account, and there is immense outrage to this day over the impunity that has persisted for these killings. Since the mass killings of 2019, Amnesty International, together with other human rights organizations, have been calling on member states of the UN Human Rights Council to set up an investigative body in order to investigate the crimes committed and to hold the authorities accountable. We repeatedly warned that without accountability, more protesters are at risk of being killed or otherwise harmed by the authorities. Sadly, it took many years until the international community finally heard the cries of victims and their families for justice. And following the latest protests in November 2022, finally member states of the UN Human Rights Council convened a special session and adopted a resolution that established a fact-finding mission. You might ask what the benefit of this fact-finding mission is in this context that the authorities continue their campaign of killings, torture and repression. The fact that the UN Human Rights Council finally adopted a resolution to establish a mechanism sent a strong signal to the authorities that the international community wants to scrutinize their record more than before. The fact-finding mission would also set up a structure that human rights defenders and victims can share their testimonies and evidence of the crimes committed with the UN. And this fact-finding mission is mandated to collect this evidence, preserve the evidence, and ensure that it is collected and preserved in a way that can be later used in future prosecutions. It will therefore send a message to the perpetrators that their crimes will not go perpetually unpunished, and that there is a will by human rights defenders and activists to identify them, even though the path to justice and to accountability is certainly difficult and fraught with many challenges. I'd like to just briefly mention something about the very last slide as well. That could be a topic of a totally separate lecture. It goes back to the 1980s when the Islamic Republic extrajudicially executed thousands of political dissidents in order to consolidate power. So between 1979 and 1988, which was the first decade after the revolution that led to the establishment of the Islamic Republic system, there were many dissidents and political activists who had a different vision for Iran, and many of them had taken part in the revolution. But immediately after the overthrow of the previous monarchy regime and establishment of the Islamic Republic system, the authorities exterminated thousands of dissidents in order to consolidate the Islamic Republic system. And to this day, there is an ongoing struggle to seek truth and justice for the thousands of dissidents who were killed in the 1980s. These executions that are taking place today in connection with the protests are not therefore taking place in a vacuum. It's taking place in a historical context where the authorities have repeatedly used the death penalty as a tool of political repression. In the 1980s, when thousands of people were executed, including in the summer of 1988, when in the course of several weeks, according to Amnesty's historical records, between 4,000 and 5,000 political dissidents were secretly executed and buried in unidentified secret mass graves. There was not that much of an international outcry. It took years for the international community to even become aware about the scale of the killings that took place in that decade, including in the summer of 1988. In that year, Amnesty was actually one of the only organizations at the time that issued urgent actions and press releases and tried to raise awareness. And 30 years afterwards, we issued a comprehensive report marking the 30th anniversary of these mass killings, and we concluded that the authorities not only committed crimes against humanity in 1988, they continue to commit the crime against humanity of enforced disappearance by concealing the fate of those secretly killed and the whereabouts of their remains, and the destruction of their mass grave sites and the persecution of their families who want truth and justice. So all the current ongoing atrocities take place in this historical context where there was never justice for mass killings, and the authorities deprived people of their right to life in order to pursue a specific political strategy. At the moment, many in the country do not accept this impunity anymore and demand that the country moves to a different political system that would respect the right to life and that would abolish discriminatory laws and practices. This vision is very much and beautifully captured by the slogan of Women, Life, Freedom, which you saw on the advertisement of this lecture. Of course, for different protesters and people following the situation, the slogan could have different meanings and connotations, but there is no question that there is immense outrage in the country over the authorities' historical and ongoing assault on the right to life, whether through the death penalty or through unlawful killings or through deaths in custody that go unpunished and uninvestigated, or through the use of lethal force against minorities who engage in cross-border activities, and border guards fire on them even though they are unarmed and pose no threat whatsoever to the security of border guards. And the woman aspect of the chant is extremely important because it shows that the protesters have reached a level of maturity and know that equality and the abolition of gender-based discrimination is critical for the transformation of Iran and its transition to a system that would respect people's human rights. This is, how much time do I have? I'm near that end. So I continue while I figure out how much time I have. This is a collage that we issued in 2017, which now feels like a long time ago, and it's about some of the human rights defenders that we were campaigning for at that time. Some of them at the moment are currently in exile, others have passed away, and many of them are currently in prison because the authorities rounded up many former prisoners of conscience immediately after the protests started in order to prevent mobilization and formation of groups and associations. I included it just to remind ourselves that the protest did not suddenly emerge out of a vacuum. It builds on decades of struggle by brave human rights defenders for a different society that would be human rights respecting and equal. This is the picture of 4 of the young protesters who were executed over the past 1 month. And I wanted to show this one more time in order to repeat the plea that at this time it is very important for all activists and human rights defenders around the world to take action in order to put pressure on the authorities to end the death sentences that have been issued against these young men, or to drop the offenses brought against them that carry the death penalty. And this is just a poster from Germany by our colleagues in Berlin, and I included it because it shows the importance of solidarity with the protesters in Iran. These kinds of actions by activists around the world are very much noticed by protesters and human rights defenders inside Iran. As soon as the protest started, Amnesty International issued a public call urging anyone with information, victims and their families to contact the organization. We were overwhelmed with hundreds of messages that we received from inside Iran, and people repeatedly asked us to echo their voices at the international level and to ensure that their cries for human rights are heard globally. A few more clips if we have time. Yeah, okay, we have enough time. So one of them again shows the brutalities that were committed by the authorities and the bravery of the protesters in the face of this repression. Morning ritual in Iran, where people mark the 40th day after the death of someone, and it sparked another wave of protests in the country. Once again, the authorities opened fire on mourners and protesters, and in late October and early November, we had another horrific spike in the number of protesters made by the security forces.
On top. Yeah.
In the tab?
Yeah.
Yeah. On the speaker. In the tab, if you click on the speaker in the tab, yeah, you see the little X right next to it. In the open one, yes, a bit more to the left, yeah.
Moral support for the protesters inside Iran, and they generally receive a lot of coverage by independent Persian language media outlets outside Iran that are watched by millions inside the country.
Any questions? You can also ask this opinion and we can translate them.
Thank you very much for coming to Slovenia. I wanted to know which model we can say this is a revolution, because in science I talked with a lot of professors and they told me we cannot till now this is a revolution, but I saw a lot of protesters and Iranian people want to say this is revolution, and which model we can talk with European people and show them this is revolution from women.
As my background is in human rights law, I'm not the best person to comment on this because it needs some theoretical background in sociology and political theory. Of course, it's for people at the end to define and put a name on their protests. We saw from the early days that many were referring to this also as an uprising or a revolutionary uprising. The future would show at what point scholars and commentators would begin using the word revolution. There's no question, however, that in the sense of transforming the mindset of the people and the society. The ongoing movement has led to that kind of massive societal transformation. The political establishment has not yet changed, and there are no signs that they would be willing to change their course and open up the society. So in that sense, there has been no exchange of power, and according to some strict definitions, the revolution would take place when there is that political transition. But if you take a more sociological approach and talk about the fundamental transformation in the values and political and societal vision of the people, you could say that to some extent psychologically a revolutionary process has taken place and taken hold over the society. Anyone?
Thank you. I wanted to ask, what is exactly the mechanism from the UN that Amnesty is advocating for? Because that really wasn't clarified during the talk. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yes, you will have noticed that many of the videos ended with a call on the UN to set up an investigative mechanism. Fortunately, we achieved that objective. This investigative mechanism is now called the fact-finding mission within the UN Human Rights Council. If member states of the UN Human Rights Council determine a situation to be so grave that it requires an international investigation because the authorities inside the country have shown that they are unwilling or incapable of conducting investigations, they can appoint a group of experts to conduct investigations about the kind of issues that the Council identifies in the resolution, and also to mandate them to gather and preserve evidence. This is something that we believe is absolutely needed for Iran because unlawful killings and other serious crimes under international law consistently go uninvestigated and unpunished. This fact-finding mission has now been given a mandate to produce a comprehensive report in a year from now, which will be presented to the UN Human Rights Council. These reports are of great significance at the international level because they are produced by independent UN experts, and many governments around the world rely on them to know the truth and to then approach the authorities of the country concerned and hold them accountable, whether through bilateral engagements or at the international level. The report is also important for any efforts that become possible in the future to hold authorities criminally responsible. It analyzes the patterns of violations that were committed and may conclude that they amount to certain crimes under international law. Then, as I mentioned, the mechanism would also preserve the evidence, including about the identities of perpetrators. It will depend to what extent they manage to access information and evidence from inside the country. As human rights organizations, we will try our best to connect victims of human rights violations, lawyers and others with information with the fact-finding mission so that they can properly investigate the range of violations that have been committed. Fact-finding missions are the first step. It's not going to resolve the human rights crisis by any means, but it shows a strong signal to the authorities that the international community is now prepared to increase its scrutiny of the authorities and their security forces. Sometimes, for some countries, these fact-finding missions are extended if the human rights situation worsens or continues to be at a critical level. For example, in the case of Syria or Myanmar, there is a permanent investigative body, but the one for Iran at the moment is limited to a year. And by the end of next year, there has to be this report. Anyone?
opportunity. I was wondering, it's a difficult question, and I'm asking about your feeling, or perhaps if you have contact with people in Iran. But on the one hand, we've known in Amnesty that there has been a lot of courageous people, human rights defenders, actually paying a very high price for their activism during the years and the decades. But now there are those very tragic events of people being put to jail, in jail and executed even. But at the same time, is there a sense of optimism in terms of there being the crowds, more people, not just individual human rights activists? What is the feeling in Iran?
The feeling is a combination of hope and grief. It is a time of mourning for many ordinary people in the country because they are bombarded by cruelties, unspeakable cruelties on a daily basis, and that has affected the emotional soul of the nation for sure. At the same time, you hear from many people that they have never been this hopeful, and this time feels very different because finally there is this growing consensus among various sectors of the society to stand up and demand a different future. And that level of solidarity and determination to challenge the status quo is unprecedented in the country. At the same time, many know that the cost is very high and the authorities have used all the toolbox of repression in order to send that message of fear and intimidation to the society. It certainly has its impact. We cannot pretend that the protest can continue at the same level of intensity when the security forces have already killed hundreds of people, injured thousands more, blinded women and children and young men. But it hasn't convinced people to completely end uprising and go home, and that would not happen. And you hear that from many people that in one way or another, the struggle will go on. Part of this struggle is to remain hopeful and not to allow despair to take over you. That's also something you hear a lot from people, that this is not the time of despair. It is certainly a time of mourning. We need to respect all the people we've lost in the struggle, but we don't have time to sit in silence and just mourn. We also need to channel that rage and sorrow into action, and for that we need hope. And that's part of that hope comes from the media coverage that the protest receives at the international level, the messages of solidarity that protesters receive from around the world, the number of street actions that they see take place in front of embassies.
I was wondering about it, how the international community, like ordinary people going to the streets, demonstrating, and at the same time having discussions on the highest political level, is this a source of strength? And perhaps a small detail about how is it to work to research situation for Amnesty now? Are there any differences? It is more difficult than 2 years ago, or it's in a way easier because you have access to many people? Are there any changes also in terms of doing research?
It is immensely challenging to work on a crisis that has no end in sight with the kind of limited resources that we have got at Amnesty. Our lives are not the same as they were in August. Iran is always a challenging country because there's been a protracted human rights crisis in the country. We were always overwhelmed with mass detentions, systematic patterns of torture, hundreds of executions every year. So there has always been that level of emotional and intense psychological labor that goes hand in hand with the hours of work that this kind of research particularly remotely takes. But it has all been taken to a very different, overwhelming level since September. But at the same time, as human rights defenders, we are encouraged by the heartwarming messages that we receive from victims and their families. And even if we manage to stop one execution, that gives us hope that we should continue and explore every avenue until we can secure that sentence being quashed.
Thank you. Any other question for someone? Any perhaps comment or reflection? Yeah.
I wanted to know the problems for people when they will be in a court. And can you share with us about your opinion about the Islamic regime, Islamic court? What is it, the judge? They cannot have a lawyer, and they cannot to show to their family that they are in a prison and these problems.
For years, Amnesty International has said that the justice system in Iran is systematically and fundamentally unfair. And from the moment of arrest, individuals are deprived of their basic due process rights, which include access to a lawyer from the moment of arrest, communication with the outside world, protection from torture and other ill treatment, exclusion of evidence that's obtained under pressure or without access to a lawyer. All these rights are systematically violated in Iran. As a result, the trials may not be characterized as fair in any way whatsoever, and therefore the convictions and sentences that come out of this process have no legitimacy, and they all need to be quashed. And depending on the charges concerned, either the person must be immediately and unconditionally released or granted a fair trial. Amnesty always calls for the unconditional and immediate release of anyone who has been arrested simply because of the peaceful exercise of their human rights, the right to freedom of expression, association, and assembly. And there are thousands of people in Iran who are subjected to criminal proceedings because they simply want to exercise their human rights. They include women who are targeted because of defying compulsory veiling, religious minorities who want to practice their faith and are not allowed by the authorities, ethnic or national minorities who seek autonomy. All these groups, if they are targeted with detention and criminal prosecution, they must be immediately released and their charges must be dropped. For those who are accused of recognizable crimes like assault or murder, they have the right to a fair trial, and the current justice system does not respect that right. Therefore, Amnesty always calls for those sentences to be quashed as well. The UN Special Rapporteur has said that the flaws in Iran's criminal justice system are so deep and systemic that almost every execution, if not all executions in Iran, amount to arbitrary deprivation of the right to life.
Thank you, Raha. Any other question, comment?
Maybe I have one basic question. You also mentioned the importance of action in Europe. So I would like to know how, in your opinion, should the action taken by us, like as European citizens, should look like? What is the most important for the protesters and so on? Thank you very much.
Thank you. At this critical juncture, when many protesters are at risk of execution. One of the most life-saving forms of action is to put pressure on the embassies of the Islamic Republic of Iran in every country. If you follow, for example, our social media accounts, you will learn about people who are at risk of execution, and we always encourage people to pick up the phone and call the embassy, mention the names of those who are at risk of execution, and ask the authorities to stop the execution and convey your message to the authorities in Tehran. You could also send them an email and reiterate the same point. We issue what is called an urgent action at Amnesty. The urgent action includes a sample letter on the first page with the names and of those at risk and the key concerns, and it always has some recommendations at the end. So it's very easy for activists to just use that sample letter and bombard the Iranian authorities with these messages. And I assure you that it has been life-saving on many, many occasions. I've been with Amnesty since 2014, and we have stopped dozens of executions through that mobilization. Of course, now it's a different situation. The authorities are reaching a new law, and they are sadly not responding to the methods that for many years activists worked in some cases. And for that reason, it's important to escalate the public pressure as well.
I have a question. In the beginning of December, Attorney General in Iran gave a statement that morality police was to be, or was disbanded. There was no proof or actual documents confirming that statement. So I just wonder how you assess such statements. Is it just kind of way to manipulate public opinion and give kind of fake responses to international pressure? Or is it maybe a sign of authorities actually considering dismantling morality police, although we know they're not the only one who are controlling the women on the streets. So I wonder how you see that as a good sign, or just another way to basically ignore the demands for change.
We issued a press release the day after this announcement and explained why this was a strategy by the authorities to deceive the international community and hide the various procedures and laws that are in place and lead to compulsory veiling in the country. The authorities have tried to pass the buck of responsibility to each other since these protests erupted over the structure of the morality police and who has control over it. For decades, this morality police was funded by the Ministry of Interior and is part of the police system. Now the authorities claim that the morality police is not there anymore, and they have made various other statements that say they need to adopt smarter strategies in order to enforce compulsory veiling. They fine women drivers who are seen behind the wheel without a veil. They prevent women from entering public institutions, banks and hospitals if they do not wear the veil. And the important thing to remember, which we also emphasize in the press release, is that all the laws and regulations that enforce compulsory veiling in Iran need to be abolished for women to know for sure that they would no longer be subjected to the brutality that led to the death in custody of Zinani. And none of that has taken place. In fact, in the days following that announcement, there were numerous other official statements that said compulsory veiling must be enforced and we should not tolerate this new scene that has emerged in many places across Iran where women dare to go to the street without veiling. The authorities have not shown any sign of compromise or retreat, but because of the courage of the women and young girls who've taken to the street, The streets of many big cities at the moment do not look like how they did in July or August before the protests started. Women have managed to appear in public now without veiling, but it doesn't mean that they would not run the risk of arrest, because under the current laws they could be punished with imprisonment, flogging and fine. Distressingly, in recent days, a number of parliamentarians have said that they are working on a bill to increase the penalties that would apply to appearing in public without a veil. It's also important to remember that one other strategy that the authorities have pursued is to reduce the demands of the protesters through the abolition of compulsory veiling. There's no question that compulsory veiling is an extreme form of discrimination and violence against women, and it forms the core of the movement in the sense that it represents subjugation of women in the society, but the grievances and the demands have gone beyond compulsory veiling. Even if the authorities abolish compulsory veiling, that wouldn't end the uprising. Not to mention that it's unimaginable for the Islamic Republic system to abolish compulsory veiling because it has defined it as its ideological red line. It was the first action that they took against women in 1979. For many say that for compulsory veiling to be abolished is like for the Berlin Wall to come down. It has that ideological status in the mentality of the Islamic Republic system.
Thank you. We have another question here.
Considering that you accentuated the importance of media in boosting morale and everything, have you seen as an activist, when it comes to like Iranian activists, but also yourself as like a foreign activist coming to Iran, have you seen the surge in like online surveillance and censorship when it comes to social media and the internet as a whole?
Yes, the authorities have escalated their attacks against online activists and those who give media interviews to English language channels as well as Persian-speaking channels. A lot of activists and media workers have reported that their relatives in Iran are being summoned for interrogations or threatened with arrest and detention if their loved ones outside Iran do not stop their activism. The intelligence apparatus is also heavily targeting journalists who work for the Persian service of BBC and some other Persian language media channels outside Iran. And they have gone as far as threatening them with death. In London, a number of TV studios now have police stationed in front of their studios because of the escalated death threats that they've received. I haven't received these kinds of threats physically, but online harassment is sadly very, very prevalent. And it's a tool by the intelligence apparatus to lower your mood and create fear and intimidation. Overall, though, they haven't succeeded, and oftentimes, despite grave threats, activists and media workers have continued their work. Any other question?
I was wondering, because you said that this decision or announcement about morality police was actually a distraction by the authorities. Were there any other concessions or distractions as a response to the not just widespread protests inside the country, but actually bigger attention of the international community?
Domestically, no. There haven't been any signs that the authorities want to seize their campaign of lethal repression. At the international level, their discourse sometimes differs from what they say inside the country. For example, in the lead up to the UN special session in Geneva in late November, they sent over 20 massive reports to various governments and promised investigations and claimed that they are trying their best to de-escalate the situation. And while they were making these claims to deceive the international community about the situation on the ground, in the lead up to that special session, we documented the killing of at least 60 men, women and children just in the course of 1 week before the session. That also shows the importance of human rights documentation, because it's not like the authorities are just sitting inside the country orchestrating this repression. They actively try to create misguided or misperception outside the country, and it's very important to counter their false narratives with facts and evidence. But yeah, no other, apart from these false promises of de-escalation, which they haven't done inside the country, all we've seen are ongoing trends to issue death sentences and have them carried out swiftly and even in public.
Thank you. Any other question? Comment? In which case, I thank you very much. I'm sure that we have a lot of food for thought, a lot of very heavy information that really lays heavy on our hearts. We have here, but I hope also that we have a bit of hope also us outside when we hear that there is this courageous fight still going on in Iran, and when we hear that it means so much to people there. I think we are all encouraged to act also here, or perhaps we will act more. In Amnesty, we always invite you to sign petitions, to share petitions, and remember that it is important that, as you mentioned, they are saving lives. People are kind of literally, their lives can be saved by not being on the death row anymore. So I thank you very much for this, for coming here to share your insights with us. And Raha will be here also tomorrow, and she will do quite a lot of interviews also in the media. So I invite you to perhaps read and listen to this also and share, because this is also a way of activism, that you kind of share information with other people. So thank you for coming here. Thank you, Raha.
For your time.